Kolesterolüm yüksek çıktı. İlaç mı kullanmalıyım? Etçil beslenmeye başlayacağım ama kolesterolümün yükselmesinden korkuyorum. Yüksek et tüketimi kalp ve damar sağlığına zarar mı veriyor? Et tüketimini olabildiğince azaltıp karbonhidrat tüketimini arttırarak kalbimize iyilik mi yapıyoruz? Eğer bu ve benzeri sorular aklınıza takılıyorsa bugün bunları bu videoda en yetkili ağızdan cevaplayacağız.
When you measure your triglyceride in the fasting state, you are actually looking at how your liver handles the carbohydrate, and in particular, the sugar in your diet. Because those VLDLs, those triglycerides, they are what your liver does with sugar. It turns sugar into fat, and it turns it into fat and packages it as VLDL. And then those VLDLs offload elsewhere and become the small, dense LDL. And if the goal is to get rid of the small, dense LDL, that means you got to get rid of the sugar because that's what made it. So by understanding what each of these species are and how one goes to the other, then you can look at a lab slip and understand the evolution of those species, in a photograph. And so you can basically figure out what happened where, which process is going on, and therefore what you need to do about it. Now, do you think your doctor's doing that?
Unfortunately, no.
Birazdan ekranlarınıza getireceğim röportaj Dr. Casey Means tarafından yapılmış bir röportaj. Dr. Casey Means Stanford Üniversitesi'nden mezun olmuş. Üzerine Stanford Üniversitesi Tıp Fakültesinden tıp doktorası yapmış. Uzun yıllar hekimlik yapmış. Arkasından bir özel sektör kuruluşu kurarak yine metabolizmayla ve insan sağlığı ile ilgili hizmetler vermeye özel sektörde devam etmekte olan birisi. Ve halihazırdaki Trump yönetimi tarafından da Amerika Birleşik Devletleri Gıda ve İlaç Dairesi'nin başına düşünülen birkaç isimden birisi, belki de Gıda ve İlaç Dairesi Başkanı olacak. Böylesine etkileyici bir kariyere ve özgeçmişe sahip olan Dr. Casey Means'in karşısında el pençe divan durduğu kişinin adı ise Dr. Robert Lustig. Dr. Robert Lustig emekli bir profesör. Emeklilikten sonra da profesör unvanını kullanmaya devam etmesi için akademi tarafından kendisine Profesör Emeritus unvanı verilmiş. Yani emeklilikten sonra da profesör unvanını kullanmaya devam edebilirsin denilmiş. Onursal profesör, emekli profesör. Dr. Robert Lustig'in hakemli dergilerde yayınlanmış 105-110 gibi makalesi var. Ayrıca kendisi sağlık ve metabolizma üzerine pek çok kitap da yazmış bir kişi. Ben de onun kitaplarından 2 tanesini okudum ve son derece faydalı buldum. Bu kitapları bu şekilde Türkçe'ye çevirmemişler tahmin ediyorum. Çevirmişlerse de serbest çeviri yapmışlar. İsimleri farklı. Ben hangi isimle yayınlandıysa şayet hangi isimle yayınlandığını bulamadım. Ama Dr. Robert Lustig'in bir Türkçe kitabı olduğunu biliyorum. Büyük ihtimalle aynı şeylerden bahsediyordur. O kitabı da okursanız çok büyük fayda sağlayacağınıza eminim. Dr. Robert Lustig metabolizma üzerine hocaların hocası diyebiliriz. Gelin bugün şu kolesterol konusunu en yetkili ağızdan bir dinleyelim.
Well, let's just start by giving a quick overview of the 4 main elements of a cholesterol panel. What's in it and what do each of these tests mean and represent?
All right. The first is the total cholesterol. Throw it in the garbage. Just throw it in the garbage. It means absolutely nothing. Anyone who tells you my cholesterol level is high, tell them you don't know what you're talking about, because a total cholesterol is useless. You need to know what kind of cholesterol you're talking about. So that is the first piece. The second piece is called LDL. Now, LDL has a checkered history, to say the least. There is no doubt, absolutely no doubt, that LDL levels correlate with heart disease risk in large populations. That is true. I don't argue that. And yes, you do need to know your LDL. But the medical profession places way too much significance on this test. And they do it because we had a drug for it. Okay? The very first statin, lovastatin, came out in 1987. And so we put all our eggs in that one basket and said, LDL matters the most. Turns out the hazard risk ratio for high LDL and heart disease is 1.3. In other words, if you have a high LDL, you have a 30% more likely risk of developing a heart attack in your lifetime. Now, that's not nothing. That's real. That's reportable. That's public health, intervenable. I don't argue that. So you do need to know. But there's something that's much more concerning, which we'll talk about in a moment. Now, here's the problem with LDL in 10 words or less. There's not one, there's two. And when you measure your LDL, you're measuring both at the same time. Now, it turns out only one of the two matters for heart disease. The other one is actually completely cardiovascularly neutral. But the measurement picks up both at the same time. So the question to you is, how do you know which one's which? How do you know whether or not, if you have a high LDL, whether it's the kind that matters or the kind that doesn't? And that's what your doctor does not know. So he's going to say to you, well, you have an LDL level of 150 and that's high. And hey, you need a statin. Well, maybe you do and maybe you don't. But you don't need that statin based on an LDL of 150, that's for sure. What you need to know is which of the two predominate in your lab test. How do you figure that out? That's where things get a little complicated. You need to know another piece of information that's in that lipid panel, and it's called your triglyceride level. Now, triglyceride also has a checkered history. And the reason it has a checkered history is because a lot of times when people say they're getting their fasting labs done, they're not fasting. Okay, they had their bagel and cream cheese that morning and they're getting their blood drawn at 1 p.m. Okay, and that's not fasting. And so fasting triglycerides can be all over the map. But if they're really fasting, they actually tell you quite a bit. And it turns out triglycerides are much, much more indicative of a risk for heart attack than the LDL is. Triglyceride hazard risk ratio is 1.8. In other words, if you have a high triglyceride, you are 80% increased risk for having a heart attack. 30%, 80%. But which one is more important? But we don't worry about that because number one, they're all over the map because not everyone's fasting when they get their blood drawn. And number two, as it turns out, we didn't have a drug for high triglycerides until very recently. And even that drug has some side effects, so a lot of primary care doctors are a little loath to use it. So that's sort of the nidus of the conflict, is understanding that you actually have to understand both of these pieces of information, and you have to understand their relationship to each other. So
that brings us to HDL, which is the fourth part of the cholesterol panel. And what should people? A lot of people will hear this is the good cholesterol. How does this factor in?
Right. So HDL is, quote, the good cholesterol. It is actually a method for lipid transport away from adipocytes and toward the liver, as opposed to from the liver toward adipocytes. And it is mostly protein rather than lipid. And so that's why it's high density, it sinks. And it has been shown in many studies that the higher your HDL is, the better your recycling capability is, and the lower your risk for heart disease is. And it turns out that there are a few variants of HDL which are even better, like HDL Milano, if you're Italian. The people actually tried to give, HDL Milano to people, to see if it would improve things. It didn't. But the point is that HDL does seem to confer some protective benefit. So you would like your HDL to be high. Now, as it turns out, this was work done by Jerry Reaven back in the 1980s when he first conglomerated all of this information into one overriding concept called metabolic syndrome. He called it Syndrome X, but we call it metabolic syndrome. What he realized was that the triglyceride, when it offloaded its lipids into different tissues, those triglycerides became the bad kind of LDL, the small dense LDL. And what he realized was the HDL was protective against that. And so what he realized was that the triglyceride to HDL ratio was perhaps the single most important risk factor for determining heart disease. And that is true. The triglyceride to HDL ratio is what you really want to know. And the reason is because you're looking at the bad guy, the triglyceride, and you're looking at the good guy, the HDL, and you're looking at them in comparison to each other with the ratios. You actually have to do a computation. Most labs will give you that computation on the lab slip. And if you have a triglyceride to HDL ratio of about 1.5 or less, you'll probably live forever. If you have a triglyceride to HDL ratio of 2.5 or greater, you got a problem. Also, the thing to know is that these are race specific. So if you're an African American, your triglyceride to HDL ratio should actually be closer to 1.5, or below. So there's some, racial differences in this. So I don't want to make a, blanket statement on all of these. The point is that these different molecules that we've been talking about are evolutions of each other in terms of how they get made, how they get processed by the liver, how they end up at the fat cell, what gets offloaded, and what recirculates back. And when you get a a fasting lipid profile, you're getting basically a snapshot of where those are in relation to each other at any given moment. And so what you have to be able to do then is you have to be able to fold that into a narrative of what your lipids are doing at that moment. And of course, that's not what your doctor does. All your doctor does is look at the lab slip and look at the high or the low next to, the number.
Green or red check marks.
That's right. And so if your LDL is high, you need a statin. If your HDL is high, he says, don't worry about it, and doesn't even tell you about the rest of it. So, there's a lot to be learned from those numbers, but you can't compare them to any standard alongside it. What you have to do is you have to look at the interrelationships between each of them. And that's something likely your doctor does not know how to do because they were never taught to do it.
Videoyu faydalı bulduğunuzu ümit ediyorum. Umarım kafanıza takılan sorulara cevap olabilmiştir ve bundan sonra kalp sağlığınıza ve kolesterolünüzle ilgili sorulara daha bilinçli yaklaşabilirsiniz. Şayet videoyu faydalı bulduysanız lütfen kanaldaki diğer videolara da bir göz atın. Faydalı bulacağınız, beğeneceğiniz birkaç video olduğundan eminim. Şayet beğenirseniz de lütfen sosyal medyada paylaşmayı, beğeni bırakmayı, kanalıma abone olmayı unutmayın. Bir sonraki videoda görüşmek üzere. Kendinize iyi bakın, sağlıkla kalın, etçil kalın.